Hi everyone, welcome back. This is the second video of the week, and we're going to talk about arguments against the existence of God. So, like the last video, we're going to go over two arguments in this video: the omnipotence paradox and the problem of evil. And these are both arguments meant to show that God does not exist. So the omnipotence paradox is the first one. And this comes from Averroes and later Aquinas. Averroes was a philosopher of the Islamic Golden Age around like the year 1000 or 1100 or so. And then Thomas Aquinas was a Catholic philosopher who's now a saint around the year 12 or 1300, I think. And it also comes from Homer Simpson. So that was the video I sent out in the email last week with the readings, where Homer asks Ned Flanders, his religious neighbor, could Jesus microwave a burrito so hot that he himself cannot eat it? Can Jesus microwave a burrito so hot that he himself cannot eat it? And Ned says that's a stumper or a thinkerino or whatever Ned Flanders-y thing he says, which this is a version of the omnipotence paradox. But the more traditional version is, can God create a stone so heavy that he himself cannot lift it? So that's the idea behind the omnipotence paradox. It's this question. And the question is meant to be paradoxical, meaning that we end up with this inconsistent, sort of contradictory belief here. We end up with this problem, this incoherence. And we need to solve that somehow. And the omnipotence paradox is used to argue that the source of the problem is the idea that anything can be omnipotent, that that's incoherent. And so no omnipotent being can possibly exist. And so if God has to be omnipotent, then God cannot exist. That's the argument. Or that's what the argument's going to be. We'll talk about the argument sort of premise by premise. So the question is supposed to raise a problem for the idea that God is omnipotent. And it's sort of, this is, remember, mentioned in the last video, the idea of God that's sort of on the table here is God as a perfect being, as an all-powerful, omnipotent, all-knowing, omniscient, or morally perfect, omnibenevolent being. So all powerful. Omnipotent means all powerful. Those are synonyms. So the question it's a yes or no question, right? Can God create a stone so heavy that he himself cannot lift it? Can Jesus microwave a burrito so hot that he himself cannot eat it? The answer there is either yes or no. So the argument or the paradox is that regardless of whether you answer yes or no, you end up with the conclusion that God is not omnipotent, that God is not all-powerful. So suppose the answer is no. Suppose God cannot create a stone so heavy that he himself cannot lift it. Well, that means there's something God can't do. Namely, God can't create the stone so heavy that he can't lift it. God can't create a stone too heavy for him to lift. But that means there's a power that God doesn't have. God doesn't have the power to create a stone so heavy that he can't lift it. So, God is not all-powerful. There are powers he doesn't have. God's not omnipotent. So if the answer is no, then God is not omnipotent. God is not all-powerful, because there are things God can't do. Now, that's only one answer, though. Let's look at the other answer. Suppose the answer is yes. Suppose we say God can create a stone so heavy that he himself cannot lift it. Well, then there's something that God can't do. Namely, God couldn't lift the stone. So God is not all-powerful. God doesn't have the power to lift the stone that's too heavy for him to lift. So he doesn't have the power to do anything or to do everything. he isn't all powerful. So if the answer is no, then God is not all powerful. But if the answer is yes, then God is still not all powerful. Either way, there are things that God does not have the power to do. Either God does not have the power to create a stone too heavy for him to lift, or God does not have the power to lift that stone because it's too heavy for him to lift. So if the answer is no, God's not all powerful. If the answer is yes, God's not all powerful. So either way, God's not all powerful. And so the argument is supposed to be that there's something inconsistent in the very idea of an omnipotent being. That there just can't be an all-powerful being because it's logically impossible. There cannot be such a thing. There will always be something that the being cannot do. So it's impossible to be omnipotent. It's logically impossible. It's incoherent for anything to be omnipotent. But by definition, God is supposed to be omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, meaning all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect, respectively. So if there cannot be an omnipotent being, then there cannot be a God, because God, by definition, on the idea of God we're dealing with in this argument, then God cannot exist. So if there can't be omnipotent beings, then there can't be a God. So, as a formal argument, premise conclusion form, we can say either God can create a stone so heavy that he can't lift it, or he cannot create a stone so heavy that he can't lift it. If God can create such a stone, then God is not all powerful. If God cannot create such a stone, then God is not all powerful. Therefore, God is not all powerful. And this is a valid argument, right? There's a valid argument structure. We talked about in the unit 1 of the course. It's A or B, if A then C, if B then C, therefore C. Right? That's a valid argument for me that we talked about. It's the Dalai Lama argument. The either you can fix a problem or you can't. If you can fix the problem, there's no need to worry. If you can't fix the problem, there's no use to worry. Either way, you shouldn't worry. Right? This is the same structure, or at least the first 4 premises are. But then the argument adds on at the end. We say, all right, if God exists, then God is all powerful. But from premise 4, God is not all powerful. So therefore, God does not exist. Because if God did exist, then he would be all powerful, but there's no such thing as an all powerful being. So God must not exist. So that's the formal argument. But like many arguments, there are objections to it. So one objection is to push back on this all-powerful concept. What do we mean when we say all-powerful? Here's a question. Can God lamp dog pony? Does God have the power to lamp dog pony? Well, yes or no? It looks like the answer shouldn't be yes. Because it doesn't mean anything to lamp dog pony. That's not an action. That's not a thing to do. So saying God has the power to lamp dog pony seems like it might be meaningless. So the answer shouldn't be yes. We don't want to run around saying, yeah, God does have the power to lamp dog pony, because that's not a power. That's not a thing. That doesn't mean anything. So there are questions of the form, can God blank, where the answer better not be yes. But that doesn't mean God's not all powerful. So the idea here is to try to show that whatever we might mean by all powerful, whatever the idea behind omnipotence is, we had better not mean that God can blank is true no matter what you put in that blank. And then you'll start saying nonsense like God can lamp dog pony, and God can seven, and God can headphone spatula dog. Like that, you'll say gibberish, basically, if you run around saying that God being all powerful means God can blank no matter what you put in the blank. So there are limits. Not every sentence of the form God can blank has to be true in order for God to be all powerful. So there's at least some limit. Maybe it's just like you have to have said a coherent sentence limit, but there's some limit. We can't say that God can do nonsense because that doesn't mean anything. So here's another question. Can God make 2 plus 2 equal fish? Can God change math so that 2 plus 2 equals fish? Well, it looks like that question might be nonsense too. It doesn't mean anything for 2 plus 2 to equal fish. Fish isn't a number. And plus and equals are math relations and functions that only really apply to numbers. So it doesn't mean anything to say 2 plus 2 equals fish. So the answer better not be yes here, once again. But now here's a slightly trickier one. Can God make 2 plus 2 equal 5? Well, this doesn't look like nonsense, right? This is false. 2 plus 2 is not equal to 5, but 2 plus 2 equaling 5 isn't nonsense. It's a perfectly meaningful false claim, right? False and nonsense aren't the same thing. So this is not nonsense, but it is false. But could God make this false thing true? Could God make 2 plus 2 equal 5? Well, what would it even mean for 2 plus 2 to equal 5? Like, what would it mean for that to be true? Is that really a coherent way that the world could be? Could God make the world such that 2 plus 2 equals 5? We might say no, right? We might say, look, mathematical things like 2 plus 2 equals 5 are just sort of logic applied to numbers. There's no coherent way to make them false. They are necessarily true in that there is no way they could possibly be false. So God, not even God, could make the mathematical facts different. Not even God could make 2 plus 2 equal 5, because what would it even mean for the world to be such that 2 plus 2 equal 5? Like, it's not clear that there is any coherent way the world could be that would allow 2 plus 2 to equal 5. So even if God can bring about any possible world, can make the world any way he wants, there is no way the world could be such that 2 plus 2 equals 5. So God does not have the power to make 2 plus 2 equals 5. So if God can't make 2 plus 2 equal 5, does that mean God isn't all powerful? Maybe. If by all powerful we just mean that God can blank no matter what we put in the blank. But we might not mean that, right? That might not be what the phrase all powerful means. Maybe when we say that God is all powerful, what we mean is that God can do anything possible. God can make any possible world come true. God can do anything it's possible to do. So maybe God can turn off gravity and make people fly because that's possible. That's a coherent way the world could be. Maybe God can create a universe or destroy a universe, have two universes, because that's all metaphysically possible. But God can't do the impossible, or at least not the logically impossible, like make 2 plus 2 equal 5, or make something both exist and not exist at the same time, because those are just necessary truths. There's no way the world could be that would make those things false, or that would make those things true. That would make 2 plus 2 equal 5. That would make something both exist and not exist at the same time. there's no way the world could be such that those came out true. So there's nothing God could do, even if he's all powerful, to bring about those states of affairs, to make those things happen. And so this is the basis for a response to the omnipotence paradox. One response is that God being all powerful means that God can do anything possible. Or that if God being all powerful means that God can do anything possible, then God can still be all powerful even if he can't create a stone so heavy that he cannot lift it. Right? So we're just slightly weakening the idea of omnipotence. Because we say to be all powerful just means to be able to do anything possible. So God can be all powerful even if he can't create a stone so heavy that he can't lift it, as long as it's not possible. So why can't God create a stone so heavy that he cannot lift it? Well, because God can lift any stone, no matter how heavy it is. God can lift infinitely heavy stones. So a stone that's too heavy for an omnipotent being to lift, a stone that's too heavy for an all-powerful God to lift, is impossible and even incoherent. There's no such thing as an object too heavy for an all-powerful being to lift. The being's all-powerful. They can lift infinitely heavy stones. There couldn't possibly be something too heavy for an all-powerful being to lift. So creating a stone too heavy for an all-powerful being to lift is impossible, logically impossible. So the fact that God cannot create a stone so heavy that he can't lift it, that doesn't mean that God can't do everything possible. God can still do everything possible, even if God can't create a stone too heavy for God to lift. So on this idea, on this picture, on this response, for God to be all powerful, God just has to be able to do everything that's possible. And creating a stone too heavy for God to lift is impossible. So that's not a counterexample to God's omnipotence. The solution to the omnipotence paradox on this objection is that God is all powerful. God cannot create a stone so heavy that he cannot lift it. And that's fine, because creating a stone too heavy for God to lift is logically impossible. And God can be all powerful and not be able to do logically impossible things. Right? So that's the reply. So the omnipotence paradox tries to say no matter what the answer to this question is, God turns out not to be all powerful. And the objection is to rethink what we mean when we say all powerful, weaken it a little bit, so that by all powerful, we just mean able to do everything possible, not able to do the impossible. Now, maybe you think that works. Maybe you think that's cheating and that's just rephrasing things until you get what you want. I encourage you to think about it, think through it, decide for yourself. Now, this is our second problem, or our second argument. And this argument is called the problem of evil. So the problem of evil is an argument against the existence of God. And it poses the following problem for the conception of God as an all-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect being. There is evil in the world, right? We all agree. Nazis existed and exist now again, somehow. There's bigotry and there's needless and preventable suffering and there's murder and torture and, Spanish Inquisition historically. There is evil and horrible suffering in the world. But if God is morally perfect, then God should want to destroy evil in the world. God should want to get rid of all the evil and the suffering in the world. And if God is all-knowing, then God knows about all of the evil in the world and knows how to destroy all of the evil in the world. And if God is all-powerful, then God has the power to destroy all evil in the world. So then if God exists, why is there evil? Right? That's the problem of evil. There is evil in the world, just as an empirical matter of fact. And if God is morally perfect, all-knowing, and all-powerful, then there should be no evil. Because God should want to destroy all evil, know how to destroy all evil, and have the power to destroy all evil. So then why would there be evil if there were a God? And the argument is, there wouldn't be evil if there was a God. So there must not be a God. So here's the argument in premise conclusion form. Premise 1. If God exists, then God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect. Right? That's the conception of God that we're working with in these arguments. Premise 2. If God is all-powerful, then God has the power to destroy all evil. Right? Like getting rid of all the evil and the suffering in the world seems like something an all-powerful being should have the power to do. But if God is all-knowing, then God knows about all the evil in the world and knows how to destroy all evil. It's not like God is looking at the evil and has no idea what to do about it. And it's not like God is sitting somewhere turned the other way and completely ignorant of the evil in the world. God's supposed to be all-knowing. God knows all things. So God knows about all the evil in the world and knows how to destroy it. And if God is morally perfect, premise 4, then God has the desire to destroy all evil. God wants to destroy all evil. God wants to end this evil and suffering in the world. So, premise 5, if God has the power, knowledge, and desire to destroy all evil in the world, then God would destroy all evil in the world, and there would be no evil. But, premise 6, empirical matter of fact, there is evil in the world. There are Nazis and there are famines and diseases. There is needless suffering in the world, and there are people doing horrible things to each other in the world. There is evil and suffering in the world. That's just an empirical fact. So, conclusion, therefore, God does not exist. Because from this conception of God as an all-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect being, if such a being existed, then there would be no evil in the world. But there is, in fact, evil in the world. So such a being must not exist. That's the argument. I don't know if any of you know the song Dear God by XTC. It was a one-hit wonder from the 80s. It's basically this argument in song form. It's like a sung as a letter to God. It's like, Dear God, if there's one thing I can't believe in, it's you. It's all the people made in your image are out here starving on their feet because they don't get enough to eat from God. I can't believe in you. Yada, yada, yada. Like it's a song. I'm not going to say it's the best song that's ever been written, but it's a song that kind of makes this point in sort of a poppy melodic way. If you want to listen to it, it's on YouTube. You can Google it. But this is the problem, right? If there's all this suffering in the world and God is perfect, why hasn't that perfect being done the right thing and gotten rid of all the evil and suffering in the world? Now, there's some debate in the history of philosophy about how to read evil in this argument. One answer is just that evil means needless suffering. So like when we say evil, we're talking about the sort of famine and starvation and natural disasters and wildfires and all these sorts of bad things that happen in the world that are causing needless suffering to people around the world. But some people run this argument, and by evil, they mean like bad people doing bad things on purpose kind of evil. Like murder, torture, Nazis type evil. And so there are a few different responses people have made to this argument, depending on how we read the word evil. So how you understand evil in this argument is going to change things a bit. But the responses are all along the same basic line here. So the most common way to try to get out of this argument, to try to avoid the problem of evil, and reject the conclusion that God doesn't exist, is to say that getting rid of the evil we see would somehow require making the world even worse in some way that God can see but we can't see. So there's what I'm going to call the free will response, which is one option. And this response to the argument reads evil as meaning bad people doing bad things on purpose. So the response goes like this. We have free will, and that free will allows us to do evil things. Some people use their free will to do things that God would not want them to do. And God can't prevent us from doing those evil things without destroying our free will. But destroying our free will would be much, much worse. It would make the world a much worse place if no one had free will. If everyone was just like a robot, like a machine, with no freedom to choose what they did or didn't do. So destroying evil would require that God eliminate free will, which would actually be morally bad. To take away someone's free will, to take away someone's freedom to choose what they do with their life, would be wrong. It would be morally wrong, and a morally perfect God cannot do such a thing. So premise 4 is false. God is morally perfect and doesn't have the desire to destroy all evil, because destroying all evil would mean eliminating free will, which would be morally wrong. It would be morally worse than just letting evil happen. That's the response. But this response doesn't work if we understand evil to mean needless suffering. And that version of the problem of evil still seems to be an issue, because it looks like premise 4 then should be true. If God's morally perfect, then he should want to eliminate the needless suffering in the world. And God should still have the power to eliminate all the needless suffering and know about all the needless suffering. And so if God exists, then there should be no needless suffering. But there is needless suffering, so God doesn't exist. That version of the paradox, or that version of the argument, still goes through, it looks like. Famines and hurricanes and fires don't have free will. And it still looks like a morally perfect God should want to prevent the needless suffering brought about by famines and hurricanes and preventable diseases. So God should still want to eliminate that needless suffering if God is morally perfect. And God should still have the knowledge and power to do so. So if God existed, the needless suffering wouldn't exist. But needless suffering does exist. So therefore, God must not exist. That version of the argument still goes through. It still succeeds, it looks like. Or maybe it doesn't succeed. But the free will response gives us no reason to think it doesn't succeed. The free will response here does nothing to get us out of the needless suffering version of the argument. So here's an alternative response. One response, which some people have raised, is that just because something seems evil to us, that doesn't mean that it's evil from God's perspective. More specifically, the idea is that some things might be bad for us or bad from our perspective, but not be bad for the universe as a whole. From God's infinite perspective, looking down upon the universe might be as good as it could possibly be. But the universe as a whole being as good as it could possibly be doesn't necessarily mean that it's as good as it could possibly be for all the little pieces in the universe running around. So when we describe something as evil, what we mean is it's bad for us. It's evil to us. But bad for us and bad overall, or bad for the universe as a whole, don't have to be the same thing. So it could be that all the suffering and evil that we experience and see in the world is a necessary part of the universe functioning perfectly. It's a necessary part of the universe being as good as it could possibly be. Basically, all the evil we see in the world is necessary for the greater good somehow. So maybe looking at the universe as a whole from God's perspective, premise 6 is false. It's not true that there really is evil in the world from God's perspective. So that's one response you can take. So some people have made that argument that from God's perspective, there is no evil. That from God's perspective, all the suffering in the world is a necessary feature to make the world as good as it could possibly be. And that will avoid the argument. Now, it does require that you say things like the Holocaust happened for the greater good. And you have to think that there's no possible way that God could have prevented the Holocaust without somehow inflicting some greater evil into the world. And that's a strong claim. And it's not clear we have any evidence for that. It's not clear we have evidence against it either, but that's a strong, surprising claim that you have to commit to in order to make this response to the argument. Plenty of people have made it, though. This response is on the slides because it's popular. So there are lots of responses you can give to these arguments. And there are responses to the responses and about what you would expect if people had spent centuries thinking about these problems. So those are the arguments against the existence of God I wanted to talk about this week, and a couple of objections to them. So if you have any questions about these arguments, please let me know. Or if you have any questions about anything else, please let me know. And I will answer the questions as best as I can. Otherwise, I will see you in the videos next week.